You're listening to WRFI Community Radio News for Tuesday, July 1st, 2014. I'm Katelyn Harrop. We have freelance reporter for the Ithaca Times, Kerri Blakinger, in the studio with us today. Last month, Kerri co-wrote an article entitled "No Question, It's Gotten Worse, a Look Inside the Ithaca Heroin Epidemic," which became the week's cover story. Kerri, thanks for joining us.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So, multiple sources and publications locally and statewide, including the Ithaca Times, have published articles describing a heroin epidemic in Ithaca. Why do you think this is happening, and why is it happening so quickly?
Well, first of all, it's really not just Ithaca. This is throughout New York State, but not just New York State. There are news articles all over the internet about increases in Florida, Missouri, Vermont, Ohio. So this is not just New York State, and it's not even just the Northeast. It seems to be that everywhere is experiencing an increase in heroin use. And I think there's two causes. I think that part of it's just cyclical. I think that drugs go through phases in which one drug is more popular. We think of cocaine in the 70s. Cocaine use peaked in 1982, and then crack became popular. Heroin is popular in the early 90s. MDMA and methamphetamine were both popular in the late 90s. So to an extent, I think it's just cyclical. But in this case, there's a big contributing factor has also been the increase in, or the decrease in the availability of prescription pills. Part of that's that there's been an effort to have people dispose safely of unused prescriptions. So it's more difficult to get a hold of your grandmother's pills when she forgot that they're there. But part of it's also that this, in New York State and other states have had similar legislation. We had an act called I Stop that mandated that prescribers have to check in a database when they're prescribing something to make sure that you're not doctor shopping and seeing 3 or 4 different doctors and getting the same thing. And that made prescription pain pills much more difficult to get. So people that were abusing prescription pain pills switched to heroin. It also made prescription pain pills a lot more expensive when you even could get them. So that also precipitated the switch to heroin.
So why is heroin specifically the alternative drug to prescription pills opposed to some other substance?
Well, because they're both opiates. So if you've already got a habit, if you're addicted to, say, OxyContin, and you're actually going to be in withdrawal if you stop, if you take heroin, you won't be in withdrawal. If you take Xanax or start doing cocaine, you will still be in withdrawal. You might be high, but you will still be in withdrawal. So you're switching to an opiate that prevents you from getting sick. And since it's stronger, it also ensures that you continue to get high. It's also cheaper, which is, a bag around here costs about $20, whereas one 80 milligram OxyContin would probably be around $80. So it's a much cheaper high, too.
Okay. And you also mentioned in your article a quote from Officer Jamie Williams of the IPD, and he mentioned that there is no specific target group that's affected by heroin. Do you agree with this?
Yeah. I think that it's interesting that every so often, there'll be an article about, oh no, heroin's spreading into a new demographic. But in fact, if you, I recently read something that was tracking New York Times headlines regarding heroin over the past 40 years, and almost the same headline appears like every 5 or 10 years, where it's, oh my God, it's spreading into, upper middle class white demographic. But we keep saying this, it's obviously already there. We just, choose not to be as aware of it. But it doesn't quite have the same sort of demographic connections that you would tend to see with other drugs.
Do you think that's because of its availability and its price?
I haven't really given a lot of thought to why that is. I guess if I were going to tie a demographic to it, it seems to me that I feel like I've seen more white heroin addicts than black. You think of powder cocaine as being more white people, and, crack cocaine you associate more with black people. I think heroin's a little more associated with white people, but not exclusively by any means.
Okay. And one of the really interesting themes I noticed in your article was the failure of the treatment system. At one point, you mentioned that an individual has to fail out of outpatient treatment twice to be put in inpatient treatment and to be covered by Medicare.
Right, and Medicaid.
Medicaid,
but,
yes.
And that particular individual Vicky, that I had interviewed, had mentioned that you can then go to a 30-day program, but if, after that, if you knew from the beginning that you needed more treatment than just 30 days, after you get out of the 30-day, you'd have to fail out outpatient 2 more times before you could go to a 6 to 12-month program, which you might just know that you need from the very beginning. I mean, she did. So in her case, this must have been extremely frustrating because she knew what she needed from the beginning. I think a lot of people don't know that or aren't willing to admit to themselves the level of treatment that they might need.
She also mentioned that a lot of times it almost seems easier to go through a court-ordered rehabilitation system.
Yes, she's not the only person that said that. Although I don't know if any rehabs would actually admit that they give preference to people that are court-ordered. But, I mean, there does seem to be a shorter wait time is what people seem to observe, although I haven't, actually talked to any rehab CEOs to quantify that.
What would you say are some of the greatest flaws of the addiction treatment system here and on a greater scale?
Well, I mean, the availability of treatment and the ability to, have it paid for by insurance is obviously a big issue. But, I mean, in general, the recovery rate is low, no matter what you do. And I don't think that necessarily means that there's a problem with the way things are treated. I think it just means this is a really difficult disease to overcome. So I think a lot of people, when they see people go in and out of rehab and continue to relapse, they think that there's a problem with the treatment system. I think it's just that this is a really difficult issue, and part of it is that you need people to help you, but part of it is also that you need to make some internal changes that no one else can do for you.
Right. And on the same topic of rehabilitation, the New York State Senate in March introduced the Joint Task Force on Heroin and Opiate Addiction. And this is really multifaceted, but it's interesting because they kind of play with rehabilitation and punishment. And one part of the punishment is they say that a lot of dealing will now be considered a Class B crime. Wow, before that may not have been the case. And they also talk about carrying different drugs that can help if there's an overdose. So what do you think about the fact that they're kind of dealing with both aspects?
I think that one in particular, the one of making smaller amounts of heroin possession into a Class B felony, would have been particularly problematic because it would have made it so that anybody possessing over about $300 worth would have gotten a Class B felony, making them ineligible for drug court. So they would do prison instead of treatment, which I think is counterproductive. I mean, prisons are criminogenic. You're just going to create more criminals instead of rehabilitating someone. Fortunately, that doesn't seem to be in the set of bills that actually passed. That passed the Senate, but it wasn't what Cuomo actually signed.
Right.
He signed only 11 of the initial 25 bills, and he increased the penalties for pharmacists that are illegally selling prescription pills, and for doctor shopping. So he dealt more with the, as far as increasing punishments, he dealt more with pills in particular instead of heroin. But there were some other good things to come out of that. I mean, the anti-overdose drug, naloxone, is wonderful. And I think it should be widely available, not just to law enforcement, but the Southern Tier AIDS program around here, the Needle Exchange, has a program that you can take, like anybody, a junkie can go take and get, approved to be able to have Narcan, which it can be a wonderful life-saving substance. So it's great that they're trying to make that easier to access, and they're also dealing with trying to create better standards for how insurance companies determine whether you need treatment. So hopefully somebody like Vicky won't have to fail out of outpatient twice, go to a 30-day once, and fail out of outpatient twice more before being able to get the treatment she really needs.
What do you think are some things in our community that can be done to help this called heroin epidemic? What programs are already in place, have you noticed through your research, and what do you think can be done to kind of decrease what we're seeing?
Ooh, that's a tough one. I think that one thing that individuals can do, I think, is to be more understanding of, and I don't mean come let a junkie get high in your house. I'm not saying that. I just mean to understand that heroin addiction is not a moral failing. It doesn't mean you're a bad person. it just means that you have a disease, and it's one that you need to proactively treat. So there's no, that doesn't excuse you for not getting treatment, just like diabetes, it's something you need to treat. And I think that if people understand it that way, and it makes it easier to help recovering addicts reintegrate into society and become productive members of society when people aren't letting this hang over them like a black cloud.
Absolutely. And just for reasons of full disclosure with our listeners, I understand that you have a personal connection to the story you've been covering.
Yes, I do. I was arrested in 2010 with a substantial amount of heroin, and I served a little under 2 years in state prison for it, and I've been sober for 3.5 years now. So
that's great. And do you feel that this has affected the way you cover it at all, or has it given you kind of a unique angle covering the story?
Well, I already knew all the junkies to go interview, so when we interviewed 3 recovering addicts in there, that was helpful. But yeah, I mean, I think that it means that, there's certain things that I'm going to know right off the bat are correct or incorrect. I've seen a lot of newspapers, for instance, print really inaccurate numbers about how much it costs to, per bag or, per dose. So there's some things like that I just happen to already know. So, I mean, yeah, it's been helpful, but it's also, it's also personal for me. So, I mean, it's an issue that deeply interests me and that I enjoy covering.
And what do you think is the most important thing for our listeners to know about the local increase in heroin use and activity?
Well, I think that one of the things, not just locally, but in general, that a lot of people are not aware of with heroin is that, in some sense, it might not be as addictive as everybody thinks. I think in DARE classes, you're taught that the first time you use it, your life is just going smack downhill. And in reality, according to drugabuse.gov, only 23% of people who try it the first time go on to become addicted. And I think that's something to be aware of, because if you see, if you have a friend or if you try it once and it doesn't instantly ruin your life, you think everything you've learned in drug classes is inaccurate. And it's not inaccurate. It might have been a little overstated, but, I mean, doing heroin is like playing Russian roulette. There are very serious consequences. And just because it didn't happen to you the very first time doesn't mean it never will. So I think that's something that's important for people to understand.
Great. Well, thank you so much for coming in and speaking with us, Kerri.
Yep, thank you for having me.